Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about knitting, and I don't mean teaching you how to knit. There are plenty of videos by other people about that, well, depending on the tools that you use, I should say. Needle knitting, which is what I am doing right here, is what you would say, the default. That's what people think of when you say knitting. And some people think that that's the only thing that is real knitting. And I'm putting that in quotes because they're wrong. Knitting is something that will produce knitting. This is garter stitch, but you know, if you get a knit stitch or a purl stitch as a result of your actions, then you have been knitting. End of story. The advantages and disadvantages of needle knitting are: it's the default. Everybody knows what it is. If somebody knits, they're the most likely to know this one, which means there's more people who can teach you. There are zillions of patterns oriented towards needle knitting, and all the jargon is oriented towards needle knitting, and all the specialty stitches are oriented towards needle knitting. So you might say, why not do needle knitting? Okay, the disadvantages of needle knitting. It is the type of knitting where you are most likely to drop a stitch. It's the one that's easiest to drop a stitch. We have loom knitting, which is done on a loom. Now, instead of the stitches being on the needles sideways, they are each individual stitch is on a peg. This is loom knitting, and so is this, even though you might just say this is a knitting Nancy. In principle, it is a 4-peg loom. So, you know, you can just keep on going and you get, this is just a round. So, advantages of loom knitting. Very unlikely to drop a stitch because each stitch has a dedicated peg. It is also the go-to for me if I want to do double knitting, which is this, where you've got knit on both sides and it's double thick. It's really cool. I love making scarves out of this. This is my loom that I make extra thick scarves with. And you know, and it's not, you know, I am not going to talk about difficulty or not of learning these things, because some people will find them easy and some people won't find them easy. So this is great. As I said, if you want to do double knitting, I wouldn't try to do double knitting on needles. It's just so tricky. Whereas here it's just trivial. And knitting in the round, which of course you have a tiny example here, but you know, you've got round looms. And again, it's trivial to knit in the round with a loom, because you just keep on going round and round. Whereas with needle knitting, you know, you have to do magic loops or double pointed needles, and you know, it's a hassle. It's a hassle. Whereas with loom knitting, it's not a hassle at all. It's trivial. Oh, another advantage is that stockinette is trivial, because that's the default. With needle knitting, garter stitch is the default, because you knit, 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 and then you turn, and then you knit, 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 and that ends up being knit, purl, knit, purl. With loom knitting, you don't turn, so you just go knit, 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 knit. So stockinette is the default. And if you want to actually do garter stitch, you have to do knit, purl, knit. So it's not the default. Right, disadvantages of loom knitting. The patterns have to be adapted because of the whole thing, you're not turning. Well, in the round patterns probably don't need adapting, because you are naturally going in the round. But if it's a flat pattern, you actually have to adapt it, because if you were needle knitting and you said, you know, knit, 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 and then you know, purl, 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 or knit, purl, knit, whatever, you've turned it. With this, you haven't turned it, so you have to make each stitch, every second row, the opposite to what it would be in a needle knitting pattern. Mind you, there are a fair number of written for looms patterns, but not as many as needle knitting. I mean, needle knitting has the most patterns of everything. Another thing is that cabling is an utter pain with loom knitting, because there's no give. You know, look, I'm just right. A single stitch cable is possible. You just sort of switch them with great difficulty, right? But doing more than a single stitch cable is just a nightmare, because, you know, this is all taught out on the pegs, and the pegs won't move, and there's no give whatsoever, and yeah, it's just don't try to do cables more than one stitch with loom knitting. I know, many people do, but I don't, because it's a pain. And I prefer to avoid things that are a pain. With a loom, you're not just limited to gauge, you're limited to number of stitches. So to do as many projects as you could with you know, 8 sets of needles, you'd need more than 8 looms. But people don't worry about that too much, and there are a lot more looms available than there used to be if you hunt around. It used to be that you could just get, you know, these big plastic ones, and you could only do bulky yarn, and you know, that was just it. But there are a few loom specialists who make a wider range of gauges and stitches, and there are looms that you can buy that are adjustable so that you can vary the number of pegs used. Sock looms often, but also looms that have got little wedges in them, and Martha Stewart has got a type of loom that you can sort of mix and match and clip all sorts of things together. So there are more than there used to be, and you're not going to drop stitches or miscount stitches. You know, there they are, all on the pegs. So that's advantages and disadvantages of looms. Now, related to looms, you've got knitting machines, which are fabulous. If you want to knit in the round and nothing else. Well, no, that's not true. You can knit flat panels as well. They have similar disadvantages to knitting looms in that you've got generally a fixed number of stitches, even more so the knit stitch is the default, because at least with the loom you can specifically do a purl stitch, whereas to do purl stitches here you basically have to undo the stitches and then redo them with a crochet hook. Some people are happy to do that in order to make ribbing, but I don't want to. In other words, you deliberately drop the stitches and then pick them up in the opposite direction. That's how you get purl stitches. Obviously, big advantage of these is they're fast. You just turn the crank, but it's not always that easy because nothing's ever that easy. Things get caught and etc. These are more fussy about the thickness of the yarn that you use. They're much more sensitive to tension and getting caught and being too thick, and double strands are a pain, and yeah. So they are very good at what they do, but they do have limitations. Okay, you can get toy ones like this one, which are relatively cheap, and you can get very good ones like the Addy, which are more expensive but are much more robust. The toy ones are more likely to break with extended use. For their problem domain, they are very good, but there are things they can't do. The next two are ones that people also debate whether they're really knitting. But look, this is Garter Stitch. This is what some people call a nook, and I call it hook knitting. You have a crochet hook with a ribbon or string through a hole at the end, and the ribbon acts like the other needle. So you you pull the yarn through with the hook, and it stays on the ribbon until you've done the entire row. Now, advantages of hook knitting. 1, you have a built-in lifeline as the ribbon. Number 2, it is fabulous for cabling. Absolutely fabulous. Because you don't need a cable needle, because the ribbon can act like your cable needle. So it is similar to needle knitting, in that you are turning the work, you're doing knits and purls and so on. I'm not entirely sure whether you can whether you can do the fancy stitches like, you know, SSK and PSSO and things like that without having to translate them into something else, because I haven't really tried. If I was cabling, I'd want to use this method. I don't know, I can't really see any disadvantages to this, except possibly the not necessarily being able to do fancy stitches that have to pass the stitches back and forth. Because this is not a stiff needle, you can't necessarily do, but I don't know for sure. So, in order to mitigate those disadvantages, I have been investigating two-hook knitting. And two-hook knittings is, well, knitting with two crochet hooks. What you do is you've got your two hooks instead of two needles. And for me, this is an advantage because it's easier to pull the yarn through for someone who is used to crochet like me, and you can do things the same way. You know, here I am, I'm putting in the hook knitwise and pulling it out to do knitting, and you know, I could probably PSSO, slip the stitch, you know, knit that stitch and then pass the slipped stitch over. See, I've just done a PSSO decrease. I'm just demonstrating this on two normal crochet hooks to show that you can use two normal crochet hooks if you've only got 10 stitches, which, you know, if you're doing a 10 stitch blanket. But you can also do it with Tunisian crochet hooks if you have a longer set. So the principle's the same. Disadvantages, well, I haven't seen anybody having any videos whatsoever on how to do this type of knitting. Though you can, you know, learn a certain amount from just looking at needle knitting things. I mean, I'm doing this somewhat continental style because it's similar to the crocheting that I would do. Okay, another advantage that I perceive is that it is slightly less likely that you would drop a stitch, because the stitches don't fall off the hook as easily as they would a needle, because if you go like that, it's caught in the hook. So it is slightly more difficult to take a stitch off the hook. You have to sort of turn the hook so that it's more easily done. So, you know, that's a slight advantage and a possible slight disadvantage. You know, advantage, you should be able to use normal knitting patterns easily, because, mind you, I mean, this is not unprecedented, using hooks instead of needles. I am told that it is quite common in Portuguese / Egyptian / Turkish / Peruvian knitting to use hooks instead of needles, but I haven't seen any videos to that effect because that style of knitting is more well known for the you've got to put your yarn around your head thing, which I don't feel like doing at this point. So I think that has about covered it. Choose whatever tool you find suits the task that you want to do. That is all you should keep in mind. Well, also the question of, do you actually want to get different tools? Obviously, you might want to say, I just want to stick with needle knitting. I've got needles. And you might say, I don't want to do needle knitting. I don't have needles, but I do have crochet hooks. It's up to you. I'm just trying to give you an overview and some information as to why or why not you might want to use a different tool to create your beautiful knitting. See you later.